In this chapter, I'm going to talk about selections. Now, there's really a lot to selecting in Modo, so let's begin. Now, generally, when selecting in any other application outside of Modo, you'll mostly have the option to select different modes, select different elements, and you'll mostly be using left click or shift control to add and subtract your selection. In Modo, there really is a lot more to it. And that's actually a very good thing because you have so much more access to methods of selecting things. So for example, if I want to select everything that's in front of me, I left click and drag over an area of my model and I can easily select everything that is visible to me. If I middle click, I select all the way through. And of course that works the same way for vertices. So if I left click, you'll notice I've done that. If I left click on edge and I left click and drag in my viewport, you'll notice that I only select stuff that's in front of me. If I middle click, if I left click on any one of these, but I middle click in the viewport, you'll notice that if I left click, I only see this. If I middle click, I see other vertices as well. Well, those ones are the background ones. So I've selected all the way through an object. Again, left click on edge, middle click on the viewport, and what you get is you're selecting through. So all that is really it's disregarding the backface culling, and it's just basically selecting all the way through. So in other application, you might have to, like for example in Maya or Max, you might have to enable or disable the backface culling separately, and then you might have to make your selection, which really makes it a bit of a pain. But in here, I can easily left click or middle click, and I automatically turn on or turn off backface culling. So it's just that much faster to do that. I also have another mode where I can select items. Now the thing about items is that if you look at here, as I'm selecting these items, you'll notice that it's in fact selecting the different items in my item list, and it's also making them active in my viewport. Let me go back to, now there's actually, again, just like the toolbar, if I left click and hold on anything that has a triangle or a triangle like this, you'll notice that in fact I have access to more tools. Now the only one that we're interested in right now is items. I am not interested in materials. I am not interested in pivots or centers. Again, the only one I'm interested in is items. Of course, the reason for that is because items and these ones right here, vertices, edges, and polygons, are the only ones that are useful for the act of or process of modeling. Pivots and centers are useful for animation. This one is useful for finishing off a scene and lighting and rendering and things like that. We're only concerned about modeling, so items, polygons, and vertices is all I want. Let me go ahead and just select this object. Now, there's a little bit more to it. Let me just go into polygon mode. I don't only left click or middle click, and now what I can do is I could press and hold shift to add to that selection. As you can see, I am adding to that selection. If I press and hold control, I can subtract from that selection. So it's just like in other applications. But there's more to it. I don't only select and deselect stuff, or I can actually right click and hover over a bunch of elements. So if I right click and hold, you'll notice that I have a ray casting method of selecting. Like this. Now, there's a few things to note. Ray casting, as you can see right now, is really, really useful for polygon selections. If I select something like edges, it's still useful. As you notice, it's selecting very, very well. But if I select quickly, you'll notice that it has in fact missed a few edges. And of course, what happens is that the faster your computer is or the slower it is, it takes a different amount of time for Modo to cycle. Basically, between ticks, it takes longer or less or more time to go between selecting things. So basically, by the time Modo makes its next cycle tick, if I basically go too fast, it's going to skip all these edges. If your computer's really, 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 really fast, it would in fact go through all these edges. So with edges, you have to go slightly slower because it might miss the tick between here and it might not select the edge. With polygons, considering the amount of time that you hover over a polygon, it's really hard to miss. And with vertices, it's really easy to miss. In my opinion, what Luxology should do is they should make a small radius around the, like especially for vertex mode, a small radius around your vertex or cursor to be able to very quickly right click and go over vertices. If I go quickly over here, even though I'm going mostly over this line, I'm going, close to it, I cannot select these vertices. It's really easy to miss. So for vertex, you really have to be accurate, and it's just a really slow process of selecting. Now, it actually gets easier if you do something like this, where they are very close to one another. And now if I go over them, you'll notice that it's actually a little bit easier to select those elements a little bit faster. If you have something like this, it actually becomes a bit of a pain, and it's actually easy to miss selections. Now, of course, the reason why it's a bit of a pain with vertex mode, and especially when you're using right click and you're dragging over vertices, is because oftentimes inside of Modo, it's actually really important to select things in a very particular order. A lot of tools will not work properly if you change the order up. Now, what I mean by that is if I go into my edges here and I select all these edges in a row, you notice that I had select one after another in a row. If I go down to Edit Mesh and I use a loop slice, you'll notice that this tool has worked beautifully. It has connected all these edges all the way through, or has split them in half. Now, let's just say if I do something like this, and then I select that edge and that edge. If I use loop slice now, it starts to break apart. The order has been messed up, and even though I selected all the edges between here, because of the fact that my order was done in the wrong order, it wasn't done all in consecutive order, 1, 2, 3, then the way this tool worked was, well, the result is like this. So it's a kind of a messed up result. So that is why it's always important to select things either in order, and you really should be selecting things really cleanly. So for vertices, again, right click doesn't work as well as, for example, something like if I go down to my selection style lasso, I can easily select all these vertices. It's just easier to work with that way. I can press and hold shift to select a bunch of vertices like this, and it's just that much easier. Now, if these ones are selected in a particular order, I don't know. I mean, lasso, I don't know if there's a particular order that it selects it when you shift and add a bunch of selections, so you might want to check that out. But anyways, besides that, there's more to selections. What I've gone over so far is left clicking, middle clicking, using shift to add, control to subtract, and I've gone over right clicking to add elements by raycasting. Now, the other thing that I should mention is that if I, for example, just middle click over the section to select those polygons, what I could do is I could press and hold shift and I could press up to grow the selection, or I could press and hold, or I could just keep holding shift and I could press down to subtract the selection. Now, when I'm pressing up and down, I'm using the arrow keys that are right beside the right control, shift, and enter or return button on your keyboard. So I'm not using the number pad. I'm just using the actual arrow keys on my keyboard. The other thing that you should know is that if I, for example, select two elements in a row, I can just press and hold, or I can just press up on my keyboard, and I can keep pressing up. What you'll notice is that it'll select the next element that's in line. This works with polygons, even edges. If I select these two and I keep pressing up, what you'll notice is that it will in fact select the next element. Now the cool thing about this is that it also works for vertices, is that I can select 2, then I can skip 1, select 2, and what you'll notice is that it really should have, well, maybe it doesn't work like that. Anyways, if I select 1, 1, what you'll notice is that it'll keep that pattern. Let me try that with polygons. See, it works like this. I guess it only works with patterns, like single patterns like that. So basically what it does is if you select 2 things in a row and then skip 1, 2 things in a row, it won't work. However, if I select 1, skip 1, it will work because it's based on single selections. If I select 1, skip 2, select 1, it will remember that pattern. So 1, skip 2, 1, skip 2, 1, skip 2, etc. The other way this also works is if I just go ahead and select all these polygons here, and if I press left or right on my keyboard, I can select the next parallel set of polygons. And of course, the reason why that's shifted was because of the way these polygons are just related to one another. But anyways, if I just do that and I press and hold, or just press left or right, I can jump to the next parallel edge loop or polygon loop. Now the cool thing is here is that I can also press and hold shift and press left and right. You notice that I can keep adding to my selection. Now I can't subtract from my selection that way, but I can press and hold up or down. So shift, holding shift and up and down. Then I can press left or right and then up and down, etc., etc. So there's many ways to select that way. And I don't really know if there's anything else that I really should mention. Well, I guess there's a little bit more. If I, for example, press or select this edge loop here by double clicking, I can select an edge loop. I guess the other thing I should mention is that if I just select one edge and I press Alt L, I will select the edge ring. If I just click on one edge and I press L, it will select the edge loop. Also, what this gives me is if I go down to select, and if I go to close loop, or not close loop, but if I think it actually works by polygons like this. It's kind of, see, basically, yeah. So I have to select 2 or 3 polygons, whatever, and it'll select the closed loop for the closest, closed loop section. Now, what this is useful for is for things like fingers. Now, imagine if this was a finger. What I could do is I could easily select, the finger that way. So if this is the palm and this was the finger, I can easily just select 2 polygons, closed loop, and there you go. You know what? Let me just select it in a different order. Yeah, so it's always the same. What else is there? If I select 1 or 2 edges, or you know what? Let me just select this edge here and this edge here. Nope. Between will allow me to select every edge in between here. So if I have perhaps a complex object like, something like this, something like that. And let's just say I want to select this edge here, and maybe, let's just say I know for a fact that, it's that one there. Now I'm guessing, I'm not really sure, but let's just say I have an object where I want to select between. It will in fact select every edge between that without me actually having to select every single one of those edges. Now granted, in this case, what I could have done is I could have selected edge number 1, edge, see, it's actually, sometimes right clicking is a bit of a pain. But anyways, if I just select these two, then I can press up to select, or then I can press up and down to basically select all those edges, or again, I could just use between. Both ways work just as well. But I wouldn't want to go ahead and just, left click over every single one of these, because that really does become a little bit of a nuisance. I mean, you don't want to do this every single time, right? As you would do in many other applications. What you want to do is you just want to grow it really quickly. So this is especially useful for when you're left clicking on those items and you just press up. I can easily grow my selection like that. And if I want to grow around this, I just press and hold shift and I press up, and now you have, the object or the elements that are in the boundary of those elements. The other thing that I should mention is that if I press and hold shift, control, or alt, you'll notice that I have more tools that are actually appearing here. Now, what that basically means is that if I have a polygon selection, so let me just delete this object for now. Let me go into here. If I have polygon selected and I want to select the connected vertices, because maybe I want to have, maybe I want to select all those vertices around this area here, but it's harder to select vertices and easier to select polygons. Well, what I could do is I could easily just select polygons, and I could press and hold alt and press left click on vertices, and you'll notice that it has in fact converted my selection to vertices. Very, very useful. Now this also works for edges. So if I go back to my selection, my polygon selection, and if you noticed, I didn't undo here. I can select vertices, and if I go back to polygons, it still retains my polygon selection, and it still remembers my vertex selection. And if I go to edges, you'll notice that it, in fact, Modo remembers all my selections. This is very useful. But again, if I select a number of polygons, I can press and hold alt, and I can convert that selection to basically give me the selection of the other mode, but it gives me all the connected elements. So if I select these edges here, or maybe just these edges, like that, and then I convert it to a vertex, you'll notice that it will only select the connected vertices. If I convert this into polygons, it's not going to do anything if I convert those edges. Now the reason being is that I would need to actually select, I would need to select all the edges surrounding that polygon in order to be able to convert into those polygons. And of course, the other thing that I have here is if I select something like this, if I select this entire portion of the model and I press boundary, it's going to select the open hole or the boundary of that object. So if I select all these edges as an example, and I convert it to a boundary, and once again, it just selects the boundary of that object. Let's try this, boundary. What I did this time, however, is if I selected the polygons, it selected the open boundary or the open hole of that current selection. So boundary, it selected that. Let's try it with vertices. Same thing. Edges, same thing. So basically what it does is, once again, you make a selection, you press and hold control, and it will select the boundary of that current selection. Or at least it should. I don't know why it's actually jumping over there. See, it's working here. It's working for that tool. Anyways, it might be a bug, for all I know. I should mention that if you want to hide stuff and unhide stuff inside of Modo, especially if you have more complex objects within Modo, like for example, if I were to take all of these objects combined, and if I was going to press Control X and then select one of these layers and then press Control V to paste all those elements into one object, so you can see one layer being populated by everything here. If I was working this way, where everything is on one layer, and I wanted to hide, for example, maybe the spring, because I might want to add some details to this, shaft here. What if I was going to, what if I wanted to get the spring out of the way? Well, what I could do is I could just double click on this object, press H to hide. I might also want to hide some of these objects here, like that. And all I'm doing is I'm just pressing the H button to hide my elements. If I wanted to unhide anything, I press the U hotkey. So if I press U, it unhides those elements automatically. Another thing I should mention is to invert your selections. Now, granted, I probably wouldn't want to invert anything in here. Maybe if I wanted to do something like, select everything and then deselect a few objects, around my scene, there's other ways that I could do it, in which, for example, I could select this and then press the invert hotkey to invert my selection to select everything else. So all I do is I just double click or select anything I want. So let's just say, for example, I want to select everything except this portion here. I could just press the invert hotkey to do that. And of course, if you just go into the selection menu over here and you look up invert, you'll notice that you get that hotkey right there. If I want to save a certain selection for future use, what I could do is, for example, select these few objects here. Maybe I might want to save, okay, let me just save this piece here, the bulk of this object, and save this as a selection set. Well, what I could do is I could go into select, assign selection set, name it whatever, main whatever, and then basically click OK. Well, how do you reuse that? Well, the way you reuse that, you have a few methods. Use selection set, and then you could just pick it from here and it will select. Or you could go into lists, and if I go into here, you'll notice that I have by selection set, and I have my selection set right here, so I can add it or subtract it from the scene like that. Now, if I also go into select, assign selection set, and I go to main and I have nothing selected, it'll select everything here like that. But what if I, for example, have, I select everything like that, or don't select anything. Assign selection set, remove. You'll notice that my selection set now is gone. So that is how you add and subtract selection sets from the main UI scene, and how you use them within the display lists, or just lists overall. Cheers. You might have noticed that the entire time that I've been selecting, whenever I use left click or middle click, I have been selecting using a rectangular kind of shape. Well, what if I wanted to change that? And because, let's just say I wanted to select something like this path that I'm drawing over the screen right now. Well, the rectangular shape really won't do me any good. I mean, I would have to hold shift and then middle click like this, and then select multiple times to try to select those elements that I want. But what if I wanted to do it all in one go? Well, what I would do is I would go into the select menu, and near the bottom you'll notice lasso style, and then I go into lasso right here, and then I'm going to just hold shift and middle click over like this. In one stroke, I have the elements selected exactly as I wanted. Now, one thing that I should mention is that when you're selecting things, you have to draw over a polygon, for example. So I have to make sure that I cover this entire element. So I could be selecting inside an element and nothing's going to happen like that until, of course, I cover it entirely like that. So this is very important. And of course, it aids us because if I wanted to, instead of use the lasso style like I just did now, but what if I was working on a cylindrical object like this one here, and I go into the top view, what if I wanted to select, some of these polygons here? Well, what I would do is I would go into the menu again, the select menu, and change it to circle. And then I would just find the center point more or less, and middle click outwards, and make a selection like this. Now, one thing that you might notice is that the way the circular selection works is from center out. So wherever your cursor is, that's where the center will be. So that's why I wanted to find a center point of the cylindrical object, and then middle click and keep holding middle click until you release, and then it's going to select whatever it is that you want to select. And of course, there's the other type of selection method, and that is inside the Ellipse Tool. And of course, this one works from one corner to another. So I'm drawing an ellipse from one corner to another, and it can be whatever shape of ellipse that you want. It's a little bit trickier, however, when you want to select something like I just did with the circular, because now I'm trying to find a corner, and I'm just basically having to select twice in order to select the same selection. So try to hotkey those methods, because every single one of those has its ups, its positives and negatives, obviously. Again, for the most part, I use rectangle, but I mean, I wouldn't want to select, something like this using the rectangular selection method. I could easily select this and then press Shift and up to grow it. So there's more than one method to do, to go about that. But if you have a more complex object, then it might not be in the books for you to, use that method. And of course, the last thing that you might have noticed, and especially in the previous video, is that in Modo, the way selections work is not as literal as in other applications. What I mean by that is, everywhere else, regardless if you're using 3D Studio Max or XSI or Maya or any one of those, you need to select something in order to be able to pull off an action. So if I press now W, you'll notice that I can move my object. Well, in Modo, it's a little bit different in that I don't need to select anything for Modo to select anything for me. So when nothing is selected, Modo thinks as if, well, everything's selected. I want to move everything that's in here. So if I press W now to get into my move tool, you'll notice that I can move this entire bit. So when I select anything inside of Modo, that is only when Modo will only translate or affect your selection. So I either could select everything like this and press W and move. Of course, you notice that the performance is a little bit slower. And of course, the reason for that is because you have to highlight over, you have to basically render and highlight all these elements. On top of that, you have to display the normals, although I could obviously go into advanced OpenGL here, go to visibility, and show selected face normals. I could turn that off, so I could only basically work like this. And performance actually does go up slightly. But if I have nothing selected, the performance is even better, mostly because of the fact that Modo doesn't have to render the selection on top of the model. So it does end up working a little bit faster. But yeah, when you select nothing, everything is selected. When everything is selected, well, that's pretty obvious. And of course, when I select only a portion of my model, then that is the only portion that I actually affect. The next thing I should mention is something that's a little peculiar in Modo, and that is if you use either the advanced OpenGL or any one of these shading methods and wireframe, the way, for example, middle click to select through these elements, it changes. So if I go and change the advanced OpenGL into wireframe, and now if I try to middle click across my object, you'll notice that, well, it's inverted. Instead of me left clicking across and seeing only or selecting only what's in the front, left clicking will actually select all the way through an object, and middle clicking will select only what's in front now. So it's inverse of what you normally get with, for example, advanced OpenGL, where if I left click, I get only what's in the front, and if I middle click, it'll select all the way through. Anyways, I think that's all I really wanted to mention. There's obviously Shift plus bounds. I've never really used that tool. But anyways, that's a lot about selections. Practice around with this. I think that you will actually need to practice everything that I've mentioned here and get a grip on selections, because selections is one of those things that you will be doing the most inside of any application. When you're working in 3D, the few things that you do a lot of is you're doing a lot of navigating. You're constantly navigating to a new viewpoint. You're constantly selecting things. And then you are executing tools. So any tools that you see on here. So it is very important that you understand how to and when to use these selection modes. And the reason, for that is because if you understand all these different selection tools, you can very quickly, or you can get access to, you can start selecting and manipulating your object that much faster if you know exactly what you are after and you know how to get it. Because if you start if you're just holding shift and your control, or selecting every single one of these polygons one by one by left clicking, then it's just going to take too long. If I just right click and do something like this, it's so much faster, right? Or if I do something like that, and let's just say if I know my between hotkey, Shift G, right? So if I select something like this and I press Shift G, it's that much faster still, right? Or if I want to select a pattern, it's that much faster than having to manually left click every second edge. I mean, this is just taking way too long, and it's really going to kill your creative process. So the more that you know about selecting, the faster you can do it, the faster you'll be able to work on your objects. So just remember this. The things that we do the most often is not playing with items, it's not necessarily playing with tools as much, but rather we're always changing our viewpoints, and we are always selecting, and then we access our tools after. So navigating and selections should be the two things that you really, really should get comfortable with. Everything after that is just using tools and manipulating them. But again, getting access to parts of your model and selecting is possibly the most important thing that you should definitely learn. So practice this chapter as much as possible. You could obviously move on and watch the rest of the chapters, and practice modeling, but keep this chapter open, and perhaps maybe even the navigation chapter. But then again, you'll practice navigation when you're modeling, but keep this chapter always referenced, because again, once you know how to select properly and fast, and just go at it really, really quickly, you'll be that much more effective in modeling in 3D. So cheers.